Good evening. Welcome everyone to Ames Public Library, where for the last 4 months it has been a real privilege and a pleasure to work with Ames Historical Society to bring you this year's Ames Historical Society lectures. So welcome to the Farwell T. Brown Auditorium. I'm really looking forward to this evening's lecture, and I hope that you will all come back next year when it's time to resume the lecture series here at the library. And if you have a moment tonight, I hope that you will also take a look at all the other activities that are occurring at the library in July. I've left out some flyers in the entryway. So thank you so very much for being here this evening. At this point, I'd like you all to join me in welcoming the co-president of the Ames Historical Society, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Please warmly welcome Kathy Speck.
So this is the fourth and final lecture in our 11th annual lecture series. And Mary did such a nice introduction, and we are so pleased to have the Ames Public Library as a partner this year for the first time. So as partners, they assist us with the promotion, and they allow us to use this beautiful room at no charge, which makes it free to all of you. Yay! So if you have not already done so, please turn off your cell phones. Now, although this is the last of our regular lectures, this fall we will be offering a special series of talks that will complement our current exhibit called A Time of Expansion, looking back at the years 1915-16, 100 years ago. Now, at that time, 4 iconic buildings opened in Ames, and so in late August, September, and October, and I think most of those talks are in about the last week of the month on Thursday nights, we will present talks on the Sheldon Munn, and that will be presented by John Lott, who is the current owner, who is engrossed in trying to revitalize the Sheldon Munn. So that should be very interesting from John. The next talk will be on the history of the Octagon Center for the Arts, and we're crossing our fingers and really hoping that Martha Benson herself will be back in town to present that talk. So everybody, cross your fingers and wish real hard and hope that Martha can make it. The last of the 3 will be an overview of just all those 4 buildings: the City Hall, the hospital, the Masonic building, which is the Octagon, and the Sheldon Munn. So those talks are lined up again for late August, late September, and late October. Now, we will be doing a door prize drawing again tonight, and I think we didn't have the bowl out quite in time for everyone to sign up. And I'm going to tell you that the grand prize tonight is the full set of all 4 videos from this year's lecture series. So we have 3 of them already, and Alex will put together the 4th one. So instead of drawing before you all leave, we're going to let you sign up on your way out if you did not get a chance, and we will call the winner. So, okay, grand prize, all 4 videos from this year's lecture series. We do record all of our lectures, and as I held up, the first 3 talks are already available in our shop across the street. So if there is one you're particularly interested, the hospital, the Ada Hayden, or the Cars Pool story, those are already on our shelves. So I would like to sincerely thank those in the audience who are members of the Ames Historical Society. Your faithful annual support provides essential funding for everything that we do, including programs like tonight's presentation. Now, if you are in the audience and are not a member, we hope you will consider becoming a member to ensure the preservation of our collective past. Membership brochures are on the table right outside the door. So please consider that. It's important, the work that we do. So tonight we are so pleased to welcome Craig Bishop, who has driven down from Hutchinson, Minnesota, to be with us tonight. Craig first got interested in Billy Sunday back in 1998 when he read about Sunday and wondered who the man was. He was telling me that he was looking through his research folder and found some communications from us about Billy Sunday back in 1999. So it's been a long 16-year journey, ending with the publication of the book that's sitting out on the table tonight. Craig has a bachelor's in history and a master's in Soviet and Eastern European studies. He has traveled extensively in Eastern Europe and for a period of time worked for the State Department in West Berlin and lived in Bulgaria and Estonia. When he is not writing and researching, he currently works at Cashwise Foods as the night cashier and is also very active in his church and involved in local politics, overseeing elections in 38 counties in northwest Minnesota. So Craig is prepared. The books are just $15. They are a beautiful large format with great pictures, and he is willing to sign them tonight also. So would you please welcome Craig Bishop.
I did want to thank Kathy and the Historical Society for inviting me to come here today. And it's important to remember where we came from in life, and that's why this is so important. Historical societies help us remember our past and where we come from. And so I did want to thank Kathy and Mary and also Alex for helping out this afternoon. So could you give them a round of applause, please? Thank you very much. I just want to talk for a few minutes about the what's going to be happening tonight so you can kind of understand what's going on. I've got the PowerPoint presentation, which we're going to go through, and then there's some audios from Mrs. Sunday. That was Billy Sunday's wife. A few years before she died, they did some recordings of her life, and she remembered Billy Sunday in different meetings and things like that. So I've been able to get those digitalized and put. So sometimes during the presentation, we're going to listen to Mrs. Sunday, and she's going to talk about her different memories. So that's kind of nice, And then at the end, I've got some videos of Billy Sunday, and so we're going to watch Billy preach a little bit, and he gets real animated, so it's kind of fun to watch him, as he kind of. So I think you'll enjoy this. We're going to have questions and answers at the end, so if you have some questions, you want to answer some questions, we'll answer some questions. And I did want to mention a couple things. We've got, it's a little baseball card. We give these away for free if you want one of these, kind of as a little memento. On the front is a Billy Sunday as a baseball player. On the back, it's a little promo thing if you want to buy the book on Facebook. So you can do that if you want to just take it home and put it in the refrigerator or something like that. And then we also have, this is a DVD series. We sell this for $15, but this is by a guy named Joe Sanford. He researched Billy Sunday. He's got over 1,400 picture postcards from things about Billy Sunday. He studied every campaign from Billy Sunday from 1896 to 1935. He had 1,400 pictures on this thing. It took him 8 years to research this. He connected all his campaigns from point A to point B, everywhere. So this is really interesting. We've got those on sale over here. The book itself is, again, it's look at Tony. It's got some nice pictures in here. And so most of the pictures are in the presentation. So if you want this, I'll sign it for you later. Take a look at it. Okay? So let's just go ahead and get going here, and we'll just get started. And all right, let's just talk a little bit about, there's the log cabin. That's where Billy Sunday grew up here in Ames, Iowa, south of Ames. Now that's not Billy Sunday, that's his half brother, but that's Mary Jane Corey. That was Billy's mother, and so you can see that Billy was born in a lot of poverty. He was born on a farm out there, and his grandfather Squire Corey. And that's his father, William Sunday, and that's his mother, Mary Jane Corey. And one of the tragedies of Billy's life is in the Civil War, his father, William Sunday, died in the Civil War. So Billy Sunday had no father. And so that affected him for his whole life, actually, because he had no father. So he died in 1862 from pneumonia crossing a river in Missouri. And so his father was buried in an unknown grave. And so Billy Sunday never saw his father. And this is in Camp Patterson, Missouri. And sometimes Billy Sunday would go out to the grave as he got older in life, in his 60s and 70s, and he would just think about his dad, because I think he still wanted to meet his father, even though he'd never met him in his life. Sometimes he would just come out there, take his hat off, and go out to the cemetery and just think about that. And the Squire Corey, now actually Squire bought this section of land out here. And Farwell 2 Brown knew a lot about this, but Squire actually bought a huge section of land, and part of it he gave away to Iowa State University to build one of the first buildings on Iowa State University. Over to the right, you'll see Clearview School. And let me get my finger on here. That's Clearview School out there. That's where Billy Sunday went to school, quite close to where the farmstead was. And this, so again, Billy grew up in a lot of poverty, and so one of the saddest days of Billy's life is he had to go live in an orphanage. He was only 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and his mother was so poor she couldn't take care of her boys. And so she had to send her boys off to an orphanage in Glenwood, Iowa. In fact, you know what? She didn't even have money to get them all the way to Glenwood. He had to stop the train halfway to Glenwood, and they didn't even have the money to get all the way there. And finally the conductor said, "Where's your tickets, boys?" And said, "We ain't got our tickets. Our pa's dead, and we ain't got no tickets." And the train conductor said, "You can ride my train, boys, anytime you want." So he allowed them to go all the way to Glenwood. And so they spent this time in Glenwood for about a year. And so then he went to Davenport, and he was in an orphanage in Davenport. And so he spent his time in Davenport in one of these cottages, and there was like a series of 15 to 20 cottages in Davenport. And you know, this wasn't uncommon. This wasn't uncommon back in those days. Kids were sent to a lot of orphanages when their parents couldn't raise their kids. They didn't have the ways to help people back in those days like they do now, you know, with government assistance and things. So Billy was sent to one of these orphanages, and this was the Davenport orphanage. And that's what it looks like today. If you go to Davenport today, the orphanages are, well, they're not orphanages anymore, but they're owned by the city of Davenport. So if you go today, you can see that basically the orphanages look like very much like they did back in the 1880s. And that's I don't know if you noticed this here on the bottom, the barefoot. Billy said that at an orphanage, he said they only had one shoes, like 2 right shoes or 2 left shoes. It didn't make any difference what foot you put them on. You know what I mean? So, and then again, that's the cottage where Billy Sunday lived, cottage 15. And you know, the thing about it is, even though it was an orphanage, they taught him to work, they taught him skills, they taught him Bible verses, they taught him how to live. You know, they taught him how to live life, how to be dependable, and how to work. And so that's something he carried through for him for the rest of his life. And that's S.W. Pierce. He was probably one of the fiercest men Billy ever met. He was the superintendent of the Davenport School, and he had no leniency at all. He was very much a disciplinarian, and he was very strict. And if you did anything wrong, he put you right over his knee, and he gave exactly what you deserved. But again, it was good for him. It developed discipline in Billy's life, and that's really what Billy needed. He needed that discipline to learn how to live. Now, this is Rock Island National Cemetery, and why this is important is because when Billy was young and going to the orphanage, a lot of times the kids would they called it Decoration Day. They didn't call it Memorial Day back then. They called it Decoration Day, and they would go take flowers and things and put it on the graves of the soldiers. Because you remember, this is right after the Civil War, and there's a lot of heartfelt memories here of a lot of people who died in this cemetery. So they would take the steamboat down to Rock Island Cemetery, and then they would put flowers on the graves of some of the soldiers there. And anyway, this is interesting. I was reading a Ladies' Home Journal article, and it said, Billy was talking about the fact that there was an arch when he went into the cemetery, and it was a quote from Stonewall Jackson. And the quote was, "Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees." That was the last quote from General Jackson before he died. Anybody know Stonewall Jackson, the famous Confederate soldier? Maybe some of you might know him. Anyway, I called up when I got to the arsenal. I asked him, was there an arch in the cemetery there that had this quote, "Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees"? And he said, "No, there's no arch here." I said, "Well, it must have fallen down or something like that." So then when I got to the cemetery, there was a stone right in the front, and it said, "Let us cross the river and rest in the shade of the trees." So I think probably the arch fell down, and they took the quote from the arch and they just put it on a stone. So when you go right in the cemetery, you can see that. So anyway, when Billy got out of the orphanage, he went to Nevada, and he ended up staying with John Scott and Mary Scott, and so he taught them, John and Mary Scott, gave him some education, and he went to the Nevada high school, and he learned how to work. Again, they had jobs for him. I think he was a janitor for the high school there at the Nevada high school. I mean, John Scott, I think he was the lieutenant governor of the state, and so Billy ended up staying with them. Showed up. He said, well, what kind of work can you do? He said, I can scrub the steps. And he said it was just like what he did at the orphan's home. So he went up and down those steps, scrubbed them all down real good. And she said, you're hired. So that's the Scott's home in Nevada today. That's where Billy Sunday lived. So anyway, this is one of the amazing things about Billy. One of the really interesting stories about Billy is one of the things he had, I think it was a God-given thing, he was a great athlete. He was extremely fast. He was faster than anybody in the school. And so he eventually went to Marshalltown, and he started playing baseball in Marshalltown for the team there. And people were just amazed how fast he could run, how many balls he could catch, and they were amazed at how many runs he could score, because he could run so fast. And so Cap Anson, I don't know if you knew who Cap Anson is at all, but he was probably the most famous baseball player of that era. I don't know if you compare him to the most famous baseball player today, but Cap Anson, he's a Hall of Famer, batted 300 for 20 consecutive seasons. Anyway, Cap had an aunt who lived in Marshalltown. He was from Marshalltown. And she said, oh, Cap, you've got to see this guy, Billy Sunday. He is the most amazing baseball player I've ever seen. You know, and Cap, I mean, he was of the world champion Chicago White Stockings. So the world White Stockings, the Chicago White Stockings captain, future Hall of Famer, comes down and sees Billy Sunday, and he says, well, Billy, why don't you come up to Chicago and do a tryout? So Billy Sunday shows up to Chicago to do a tryout for the Chicago White Stockings baseball team. He's got $1 in his pocket. That's all he owns. And he shows up there, and so you can imagine, he shows up and he wants to play for the world champions, you know. And so he shows up there, he does a little tryout, and Cap says, I want to test to see how fast you really are. You got the fastest man, one of the fastest men in baseball here, his name is Fred Pfeffer. I want you to run a race against Fred Pfeffer just to see how fast you are. And Billy said, well, I really like to run, but I'd like to run barefooted. And he said, okay, fine. That's how you want to run. Go ahead and run barefooted. So he takes his shoes off and barefoots and beats Fred Pfeffer about 10 feet. So he ended up signing a contract with the Chicago White Stockings. And so there's Fred Pfeffer there, and there's Billy kind of at a young age, probably as a rookie. And there he is with the world champions there. Kind of see his picture there on the right-hand side over there. And so Billy became famous because he traveled all over the United States playing for the White Stockings, and so people got to know him. Very honest, clean-cut, hard-working kid, you know. In fact, Cap Anson gave him thousands of dollars of team money, let him do book the hotels and everything, because they knew Billy. I can trust Billy, you know. I can trust, you know. And so there's some baseball pictures of him there. I guess I didn't believe in gloves back in those days, so. So, I mean, they had the great stars in those days. That was, to the right, that's John Clarkson. He won 56 games in a year. Can you imagine that? Running 56, how do you run 56 games in a year? I don't know. And then this guy, he was the home run champion. So they had a lot of, his name is Ned Williams. They had a lot of champions. And then there he is with Cap Anson later in life. They used to do a little golfing together. Now, this is one of the things that's kind of interesting too. I got this from the Chicago Tribune in 1886. Billy Sunday was so fast, they said, how fast is he? He beat almost everybody in the major leagues in running races. So they said, let's start doing exhibition races in Chicago and just see how fast he really is. So they started running guys up against him to see how fast he was. And so he beat one guy, I believe this is correct, he beat one guy, and then they found this guy, H.M. Johnson, it's called the champion of America, the fastest guy in America. And they said, well, I wonder if Billy Sunday can beat him, he can beat everybody else, you know. And so they ended up running this guy, 100-yard exhibition race between champion Johnston and William Sunday, the Chicago Bullock, got champion of the American League. And so Billy lost by like less than a yard. And so it's kind of interesting how they used to kind of play that up. And then this was kind of something that happens, a change in the course of human life, because one time he was out kind of having some drinks with his friends, on his teammates, and a group came by with Chicago Garden Mission. And they started singing some old hymns that his mother used to sing to him when he was a little boy back in Ames, down in the log cabin. And he started remembering some of those hymns. He started remembering some of those songs his mother used to sing. And you know what? He was away from his mother for all these years, barely saw her. And I think that really touched his heart, because he just remembered kind of his upbringing in Ames and kind of what happened. So he looked over at his teammates, and they showed him, why don't you accept Christ in your life? And he said, you know what? You're right. Boys, I bid the old life goodbye. And he just walked away from them right there. And he went down to Chicago Garden Mission. And there he is when he was about 22 years old. Became a Christian that day. And then, he was making, his contract was about $4,000 or $5,000, $3,000 or $4,000 a year as a baseball player. So he was making a substantial amount of money, particularly in those days. To make $3,000 or $4,000 a year is really an unbelievable amount of money. But he gave that all up to work at the YMCA for $83 a month. Just gave up all his salary and everything because he wanted to serve God and he wanted to work for the mission. And he learned a lot about the homeless, the downtrodden, the people. And that's one of the reasons why I think he was so vehement against liquor later in life, because he saw what alcohol was doing to so many people in Chicago. So I think that's one of the reasons why he felt the way he did about that. And a lot of his teammates died of alcoholism. Some of the Chicago White Stockings teammates. So then we've got this. This is one of these. This is his wife, Helen Thompson. This has to do with after he got married and how he got this clock. So I'm sorry. Let me go on here. And
on the 5th day of September, 1888, the team was playing in Indianapolis that day, and Billy left the team to come to Chicago, and Spalding, who was the owner of the Chicago team that Billy played for 5 years, insisted on us attending the Chicago baseball game the day that we were married. I didn't want to go, but it was an insistent case that A.G. Spalding wanted him, and he had decorated their box for us, and so we were brought down to this Chicago game that was going on in Chicago in the ballpark, and ushered into this decorated box, and the whole crowd stood up, and cheered and gave us a welcome and all of that. We were only there about 20 minutes, but we hurried back to the depot to go to Pittsburgh. So we left for Pittsburgh that night. Billy had to play ball the next day. He's the leadoff man. He always was, because he could run so fast. And so he came up to bat, and I was a blushing bride sitting there in one of the boxes at the Pittsburgh baseball field. And suddenly, the umpire threw his arms in the air and he said, "Hold everything!" Well, everybody in the grandstand almost stood up to see what the man was hollering about. Hold everything. And we all saw a man walking out from under the platform, out on the field, out to the home field plate, with an armful of a clock, a great big Antonian clock, a beautiful large piece. And there was a presentation speech made to Billy as this was our wedding present from the Pittsburgh owners of the Pittsburgh baseball team. I still have the clock. It goes, and it's standing right now on our mantelpiece here in this home. And so I have given this home to the Winona Lake Assembly as a memorial, and everything is to be left just as is.
Okay, it's a neat story. All right, now this is Billy was an apprentice for a guy named J. Wilbur Chapman, and then he got a call to go to speak down in Garner, Iowa. So I'm going to play this little. Mrs. Sunday is going to talk about a little bit about how they went to Garner, Iowa. This is Garner, Iowa. This is Billy's first meeting in 1896.
Being in the hard, dark spot for 6 days, and then a telegram came to Chicago saying this. The Baptist man and the Methodist man and myself, Presbyterian, have united and we are going to hold a revival. We'd like to know if you would be the evangelist that will come and lead us in it. We have already rented the Opera House in a little town in Iowa named Garner, and let us know at once, please. So, of course, would he go? It was just like manna coming down from heaven to a starving man to get this telegram, because we were in the depths of darkness of not knowing where to go after Dr. Chaplin had gone back into the pastorate and left the evangelistic field suddenly. So he went there, and then the Lord blessed in such a manner that there was no doubt about it was God's plan for Billy to be there, because 268 people found the Lord in the 8 days of the first 8 days that Billy ever preached. And the ministers were wild. They said, "Oh, this is too good to stop. We just can't stop next Sunday. We just got to go on. This is, we just don't dare stop. This is too good." And they came to Billy and told him so, and then he said, "Yes, we've got to stop. The reason is I haven't any more sermons to preach." To the next little town, and the next little town. And from that town, Garner, there never was a time in 39 years when Billy didn't have a place to preach. Way ahead, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years ahead, sometimes had to wait for it to come.
Well, and there he is at 30. And then he started speaking in these opera houses. And, some of these testimonies, I just want to read a couple of these because he, from some of these reporters who spoke about him speaking, and they would talk about it. And I'll just read a couple. This is from Emerson, Iowa. This is where the meetings he had in Emerson, Iowa. He has a great power for God, and his preaching is stirring the country for many miles around us. His congregations are something greater than the populations of the town. This shows something of what is being done. Wednesday morning, the northbound train carried 35 cases of liquor to Elliott, but the southbound train carried the stuff all back again. So Sunday comes out strong against the liquor business, hits it hard, and hits it where it lives. So it says here, and this is from Emerson. Actually, this is Emerson here. Over 100 were converted during the 3-week meeting, and its entire history, our little town has never witnessed such a transformation. Audiences packed the Opera House to its utmost capacity every night to hear Mr. Sunday. Many a callous heart, wicked heart has been changed, and many homes have been made happy. The evangelist's power in holding the up-close attention of the audience all the way through is wonderful, and his resources seem boundless. His vivid imagination, irresistible humor, and untiring earnestness make him an unusually interesting and most effective preacher. Okay? So then we go to Bedford. Never has Bedford witnessed such a religious awakening as is now in progress at the Presbyterian Church. The Church of God is being shaken to its very foundation, and many are anxiously inquiring, "What must I do to be saved?" For nearly a week, Evangelist study is holding on his spellbound, his earnest preaching of Christ and him crucified. And then we'll go on here. Last night, ushers brought chairs and filled the aisles, for the people poured in long after the hours of service. And 2 or 3 days later, again, the church was crowded to its utmost capacity, not less than 1,300 or 1,400 in attendance. Already 160 have gone forward and taken a stand for Christ. Never in the history of this religious history of this community have there been such meetings as those of yesterday. The people poured out to the morning meeting and filled the church. In the afternoon, the place was packed with men, making the largest audience of men ever assembled in the county at a religious meeting. Some of them drove 15 miles. Well, they were all on horses. So Sunday poured hot shot into the sins of the day. As he warmed up, off came his collar, then his coat, and for an hour and a quarter he dealt sledgehammer blows for righteousness. Several times the men burst out in applause that shook the church. And then I'll read, let's see, if I can find this one. I think that's it for that. But anyway, a lot of times when Billy Sunday would leave, of course, the people would gather at the train stations for him to say goodbye to him, sing some hymns, and he'd be on his way. Then he started going into places like Keokuk. I believe, is Keokuk in Iowa or Illinois? Is it in Iowa? Okay. Sorry. I should know that. Anyway, here we go. 4,000 people hear his greatest sermon. So I'll go on here. Now, this is the interesting thing about Billy Sunday, because he became so popular in these towns that the churches, the Christians in the town would build these tabernacles for him. There's a tabernacle. You can see it up on the left-hand side up there. If you see in the top beam, I don't know if you can see that or not, but it says Citizens Erecting Sunday Tabernacle. You can see the kind of guys up in the perch up there. And then that's the inside of what the tabernacle looked like on the far right. And then that's the tabernacle, on the lower left, and that's the tabernacle as it looked on the outside. So anyway, these tabernacles, what they would do is they'd build these tabernacles, and you can imagine what that'd be like. And people wondering, why are they building this huge building? Who's coming into town? And so he would come into town, and of course, that attracted a lot of attention from people. A lot of people would come in, and then when the tabernacles were, when the meetings were over, the tabernacles, they would just tear the tabernacles down and sell the wood for the expenses of the meetings. So that's just how they did it. And of course, they didn't have football stadiums and baseball stadiums back in those days. Now this is from Bloomington, Illinois, and you can see the kind of crowds for Bloomington there on the lower right-hand side. And this one, the people literally climbed up on the tabernacle roof. They were able to get in the door, so they couldn't get in the door, so they climbed up the roof and looked down through the skylights in the ceiling to the meetings. Now, this is one of these meetings where I kind of went. I'd heard about this, that Billy Sunday was attacked with the guy with the horsewhip. And I said, really? Attacked with the horsewhip? So I went back and looked in the microfilm for Illinois in Springfield, Illinois in 1909. And I went back in the microfilm and I looked at the microfilm, and just went through them one by one. And sure enough, there it was. This card even says it, Billy Sunday preaching Sunday afternoon, standing on one leg as a result of a encounter with lunatic Potts. And so what happened was this guy was standing at the front of the lecture, in the front of and he pulled a horsewhip out and started whipping Billy Sunday around the legs. And so Billy Sunday jumped on top of him, and they got in this big scruffle right there in the middle of the meeting. And then the ministers all jumped on top of the guy. so you had the minister, and the poor guy just got beat to a pulp. So anyway, and so. Anyway, so this is some articles from the Springfield newspapers of that day. Sunday begs physicians to hasten cure. And they finally sent, the one on the far right, Sherman Potts, to go to Kankakee Asylum. They eventually sent him to an insane asylum. And then here's some more articles. Sunday service is the greatest. You can see that. Sunday leaves city after the great meeting, the one on the far right there. You don't do anything in life without people around you, people helpers, team members. And so he was able to develop a team of people around him to help him. And one of them was in the top right hand there, Homer Rodeheaver. You see in the top, it says Rhodey, Homer Rodeheaver. Maybe you've not heard of him. He's probably one of the most famous song leaders of the 1950 and earlier. And he was a little bit like Cliff Burrows, if you know Cliff Burrows from the Billy Graham Association. And there's a connection there between Billy Sunday and Billy Graham. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. There's also a connection between Billy Sunday and Ronald Reagan, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But anyway, so this is these are the assistants, and they were great helpers to him. And the Sunday team was well known all over the country for the work that they did all over the country, as far as the music and how they organized it. I mean, you have a tabernacle with 8, 10, 15,000 people. It just takes an unbelievable amount of volunteers and things to get these things done, So.
Was there any public broadcasting?
No.
There was no microphone.
No. There's no amplification systems back in those days. So you had to shout and project your voice in these huge buildings. You had to speak right from your diaphragm and just so. Now the great helper, Mrs. Sunday, was a great helper for him, and she traveled with him everywhere she went. And in 1911, she decided to become his full-time. The meetings were getting so big that he needed somebody to organize and do all the, organize everything with all the volunteers and everything. And so she started leaving home and spending time with him and organizing his meetings for him. The preaching itself was very stressful when you're speaking in front of 10 or 15,000 people, and he could never have possibly done this without Mrs. Sunday. She was honestly a godsend to him, I think. So she was a great, faithful companion. They had a great marriage, they really did. And that's Homer Rodeheaver. If you know anything about Homer Rodeheaver, he was the song leader from between 1909 and 1929. And he led the huge choirs, sort of like I said, what Cliff Burrows led the big choirs. Homer Rodeheaver led the big choirs, 10,000 people at a time in the bigger meetings later, when you get into the big campaigns in New York, Philadelphia, that kind of thing. And they did duets. They were the first ones to do these duets, Virginia Asher and Homer Rodeheaver, on these little records, on these Victrola records. They were the first ones to start to do duets of hymns. And this is a famous hymn of those days, Bright in the Corner Where You Are. And so anyway, the tabernacle started getting bigger. There was one in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. See, it was a big deal. I mean, a big community event when people would get together and they would all build a tabernacle, and it was sort of a real special time for everybody. And this is we get bigger tabernacles here in 1915. This one held at least 10 or 15,000 people. So these tabernacles are really getting big. And there's Mr. Sunday's preaching style. You see, sometimes he'd take his coat off, roll his sleeves up. He had all kinds of ways he want to make his points. Those are some of the articles about him and kind of witty. These are from the Denver campaign, like 1912, I believe. And then sometimes they would have a parade to introduce the campaign into the city, and they'd have maybe 5,000-10,000 people lead them in the parade. They would lead it to the tabernacle. There's Mr. Sunday there to the right, and then Mrs. Sunday to the left. So anyway, then you get to the Columbus, Ohio meeting. This is a very fascinating meeting, and this is another one that is kind of famous in the Sunday history or whatever. This is the famous women's only meeting in 1912, when the women literally broke down the doors of the building and ran over the policemen to get in the tabernacle. And so it's kind of an amazing story how it all happened. And anyway, the women went in the back door and busted down the door, and the policemen were standing there, and they were like, and they just ran over. And the policeman said, I don't know what they called the police station. I don't know what to do with these women. They're all in here. We're getting out of here, So anyway, I think Mrs. Sunday is going to describe this meeting.
We've ever held a meeting in up to that time. It was in 1912, I remember that. It was before the Pittsburgh meeting. Of course, Pittsburgh is larger than Columbus. Columbus was about 250 or 75,000 at that time, and that was a big meeting to take hold of, capital city. And one thing I can tell you about that city, there were more saloon keepers and bartenders saved in Columbus, Ohio, than any other city we ever knew anything about. I remember one roomkeeper telling me that he was so mad when he saw the papers come in with Billy Sunday all over the front page and every place, that he just kick it under the bar and get it out of his sight. He was just disgusted with it. Anyway, the day that Billy Sunday assigned to preach to women only at 2 o'clock, we were telephoned to at 10 in the morning from Albert Peterson, and he was all excited on the telephone. He said, tell Mr. Sunday that the building is filled now, 10 o'clock in the morning for this 2 o'clock meeting. I don't know what to do with them. Said they're all in here and they just got every seat taken and it's full. So I told Billy about it, and he said, well, what are we waiting for? Tell Roy to hurry up and get ready and let's go right now. I'm just keeping them, if the place is filled, well, it can't be filled anymore. We'll just go and have a meeting now. So he did. And let them out at 11:30 or so. So about 1 o'clock, the place was jammed full again on the second time. But still they began to come just as though the meeting was starting. And they kept coming and coming and coming and coming until the outside was just surrounded. And some of the older women went to the doors and just pounded on the doors to get open. I took in the situation and saw how bad it was. And so I crawled out a window and got out on a as loud as I could, and they stopped for a moment to listen at the voice, and I said, be sensible. You can't get in. You're keeping Mr. Sunday from preaching to those that are already in there, and I'll tell you what I'll do. Be good sport and do what I ask you to. I said, let's go over to the Thomas Memorial Building, 2 or 3 blocks from the tabernacle, and I said, I will attempt to tell you everything that Billy Sunday is telling his women inside. And I said, come on, be good sport. So, some of them called out, all right, Mom, we'll come. So I got out down off the piano box and got over there, and about 3,500 people filled that memorial building. And then I went on to tell them all I could remember for half an hour or 3/4 of an hour. And they were happy and well pleased and laughing when they went away. And it's the only time I ever did anything like that.
Then he left. So then when he left that meeting, he had to change clothes. He was totally drenched in sweat. And then he went to speak at Ohio State University for another 10, 15,000 people. So there was another women's meeting that night. So he spoke to about 40,000 women in one day. So, I mean, that's a lot. And that shows the outside of the tabernacle there. You can see the women trying to crowd in. You can see the crowd there. Now, this is another interesting story here. I kind of looked this one up too, and I heard this story about how Billy Sunday had a confrontation with this lady named Emma Goldman. And so, again, I looked this up in the newspapers of that era. You probably haven't heard of her before, but she was a socialist and an anarchist in the early 1900s. She was against the American government, and the Americans were seriously concerned she had been possibly tied into an assassination plot with one of the presidents. So they were seriously concerned, and Emma Goldman hated Billy Sunday, and it just so happened that her and Billy Sunday were in the same town together, so she came to one of his meetings. And then so she came to one of his meetings, and Emma Goldman, they had to prepare for their counterblast. They call him a good clown. And so they had their own little meeting where they spoke against God, and they spoke against Billy Sunday, and they made fun of the whole thing. That very night, that Turn Hall, the whole building burned down. So, but nobody, I don't know what, they ended up, somebody didn't put their cigarette out, they ended up burning the whole building down. So it's just kind of one of those things. They think, what's interesting about it, when the building burned down, the walls collapsed on the inside. If the spread would have fire, the fire would have spread all over the whole blocks, but the buildings collapsed on the inside. That was the only building that burned. So it's just kind of one of those strange things, But anyway, so then you get into the Detroit, Michigan campaign in 1915, and you start getting into a million, they're starting to say, well, maybe 1 million people are going to come, And you see the total has already reached 737,000 with 3 weeks to go. And then they would go around to the gospel, and they would go to shops, factories, things like that. That's a picture of the inside of the... That's a picture of the inside of the tabernacle for Detroit there. Okay, so anyway, and again, prohibition was a big issue back in those days. And it may not seem kind of strange, like, why would people be interested in prohibition? It doesn't seem like, but in those days, there was a strong feeling in America that liquor was an evil and it was destroying society, and that's just what they believed. So, and there's truth to that. I don't know if you can do what they handled it, and as far as making a law, but 38 states passed prohibition. Sometimes they would send Billy Sunday in if they were having a prohibition vote in a state, and he would have a series of meetings and he would speak in favor of prohibition. Okay, and in Michigan, you can believe this? In Michigan, in 1915, they voted for prohibition. Isn't that amazing? By 60,000 votes. I don't know. It's just really, really interesting kind of times and how times change. Anyway, so then you get to New York, 1917, and there's the New York Tabernacle. This held about 18 to 20,000 people, and then this is the prayer. This is how they kind of divided it up into a great big pie, and then they would split like that's Manhattan, and then they would split it up into different sections. So they would have prayer meetings going on all over the whole section of Manhattan. And he did this all. He came from Ames. Isn't that amazing? Really, he came from Ames. I mean, just a small town, And he's all over the country doing all this, Just really something. And so we're going to play this video clip here. Whoops, hold on. This is
Papers got their heads together about, we had 24 seats built, desks and chairs for 24 writers for the different newspapers and the different columnists and the magazine writers to come and sit in their own individual seats all the way through the meeting. So they got the idea. They said, well, now we're going to keep track of this ourselves. We're not going to take anybody else's count for how many people come forward. And we're going to select our best man that we feel that will be there every single night for the 10 weeks and the afternoons as well, and keep track of the number of people that come in response to Mr. Sunday's invitation to be saved. The result of this man, the count, for all the time, the 10 weeks of Mr. Sunday's invitation to New York City, amounted to 98,489 people. And the heading said we had hoped it would be 100,000, but it was only 98,489 people. Maybe you didn't know that Billy shook hands with every single person that ever came to give their heart to the Lord, and gave them a pat on the shoulder and smiled. It was a wonderful thing.
okay. Well, this is met President Wilson, so we'll do this one real quick.
Asked Mr. Sunday not to go overseas the first war, as he was ready to do, and getting our visas, and we had letters from Wanamaker and from other people to be introduced us over there and all that. So the President said to Mr. Sunday when we arrived at his White House, he said, Mr. Sunday, I hear you're planning to go overseas, but I don't want you to go. He said, I'll tell you why. You're doing more good in our country. A lot of people in our country are not loyal to us. And your preaching is holding the attention of the common people and everybody in our country as you go about from place to place in your big meetings here and there. Why, it's doing more to help me than anything else you could do in the world. And I want you to stay here. Mr. Sunday said, all right. He put his hand out to the president. He said, Mr. President, you're my president, and if that's what you want, why, that's what I'll do.
And so then, Billy lived for a while in Chicago until 1911, and then he moved to Winona Lake, Indiana. And so why did he move to Winona Lake? He was in Chicago. It's kind of a major hub. Trains go in and out of there. It's a huge city. Why would he stay? Because I think I've come to really believe that Billy really liked, he never forgot his time in Ames. He liked lakes, he liked gardening, he liked being out in the country, even though this wasn't a country home. But one of the things you'll notice about this place is Mr. Sunday was always out planting something, mowing something, growing something, watering something, He also had a fruit orchard out in Oregon where he did planting his fruit trees. So he always liked the farm life. He always enjoyed being out on the farm. He always enjoyed that, being outside. And so he liked Winona Lake, and they also had the Bible conferences in Winona Lake. If you know anything about the history of the Bible conferences in Winona Lake, people would come in from all over the country to go to these Bible conferences in Winona Lake, Indiana. So, no, that's his family. This is quite a story in itself. And I'll just, that's Helen, his oldest daughter. That's George. That's Paul. And that's Billy Jr. So those are his 4 children. And then it's kind of and there they are again over here on the steps of the home there. This is kind of one of the sad things about Billy Sunday, to be honest with you. Well, it was one of those things where, and there's a picture of that's Billy Jr. on his mother's lap, and then there's Paul. And there's the Ansonian clock, by the way, the one he got from Pittsburgh that we talked about earlier. It's still up there. And then, But anyway, that's Helen. And okay, I've done a little read their letters. And, Helen, very sweet girl. She married her college sweetheart. They moved to Sturgis, Michigan, which isn't far from Winona Lake, Indiana. So she wrote long letters to her mother. Usually they were in long pieces of paper on front and back, really small writing. Talked a lot about. It seemed like she was very settled down and happy, but she had this problem in her life that, and I think Mr. Sunday and Mr. Sunday were very attached to her. They loved all their children. But she had this problem when she was growing up, like she would lose coordination, and she couldn't figure out what she would lose her strength and lose her coordination. And in 1931, I think she was 40 at that time, she died in the middle of the night. And so that was probably one of the saddest days of Mr. Sunday's life because he had to go to his daughter's funeral, and she was only 40, And so that was tough for him to do that, and it caused probably his early death. But anyway, his son, that's George, and that's Billy Jr. His sons never followed in his father's footsteps, and I know there's different reasons for that. I've always kind of, over the years, I've thought that it must be really hard to be the father of a son or a daughter of a famous person, because everybody wants you to be like your dad. Are you going to be a preacher like your dad? And, Franklin Graham had that problem with Billy sometimes, because, he wanted to be who he was, and he didn't want to be Billy, he wanted to be Franklin. And I wonder sometimes if his boys had those same problems, But part of the problem, too, was, Billy was gone on his campaigns a lot, and so he tried to take his kids out to his fruit orchard in Oregon. He took them out on their campaigns with him, but his boys never seemed to want to obey the rules, and it was difficult for him, But that's Paul. So all his boys died of early ages. Billy Sunday died in 1935. Billy Jr. died in 1938. He was leaving a party in Palm Springs, California, and he crashed his car into a telephone pole. So he died in 1938. George died in 1932. He jumped out of a building, a 5-story building, and killed himself, committed suicide. And Paul, the youngest son, he was in World War II. He was flying a bomber and doing test flying out near Palmdale, California. His test bomber crashed into the side of a mountain. So Mrs. Sunday outlived all of her children. So it was pretty sad, really. But she storied on. She kept on with her life. So anyway, Mr. Sunday died in 1935, and when I was in Wheaton, I was doing a little research. They had a thick book of all of the newspaper articles all over the country of the people who had written about Mr. Sunday, kind of his death. It was probably like, any famous person who dies. He got a telegram from Franklin Roosevelt. Although he wasn't on good terms with Franklin Roosevelt. He got along with most of the other presidents, but Franklin Roosevelt he didn't really see eye to eye with. I think their philosophies were a little bit different. And here's a few things that Billy Sunday, I consider legacies. Baseball field in Nevada. They got a sign for him out there, Pacific Garden Mission. Billy Sunday always gave money to the Pacific Garden Mission for obvious reasons. This is Homer Rodeheaver. Homer Rodeheaver lived to about 1955, and he was probably one of the most famous song leaders of that era. And there's Kathy, which she dedicated the Corey Family Cemetery. And there's, you guys have seen that before, so as far as you know what that is. Mrs. Sunday kept speaking, and she was really proud of her home there in Winona Lake. She went speaking all over the country almost till her death, and she would give tours of her home to people. And sometimes in the summertime, she would give 1,500 people a day would want to come and take a tour of the Sunday home. So it got to be too much for her. She got older, So, as you can imagine, 1,500 people. Anyway, she had gifts from Mamie Eisenhower and from President Truman there. And then there's an interesting connection between Billy Sunday and Billy Graham. They never met each other, but it is kind of an interesting connection, so I thought I'd just share with you for just a couple of minutes. There's Billy Sunday in 1917. There's Billy Graham in 1954. So what's the connection between Billy Sunday and Billy Graham? Well, Billy Graham, when he became famous in the 1940s, he used to go to Winona Lake, Indiana, and he was with Youth for Christ, and he used to do these Bible conferences in Winona Lake, Indiana, for Youth for Christ and these Bible conferences. And Mrs. Sunday was there. And so him and Cliff Barrows would walk up the hill, and they would go sit in Mrs. Sunday's home, and they would talk about the Billy Sunday meetings and everything like that. And so Mrs. Sunday gave him a lot of advice about how they did their meetings and things. And one of the things she did was she felt bad because her children had died so young. And she said, Billy and Cliff, try to have your wife stay home with your children. Don't go on any meetings, and so they always did that. I don't know if you know anything about Graham and the Cliff Barrows, but the wives always stayed home with the kids. But anyway, so Billy Sunday came to Charlotte, North Carolina in 1924. So Billy Sunday had a meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina, 1924. 10 years later, there was a group that was started in 1924, and it was still meeting 10 years later. And they decided to have a meeting, and in that meeting, 10 years later, Billy Graham came to know the Lord in 1934. So in an interesting kind of way, Billy Sunday kind of had a part, in an indirect kind of a way, with Billy Graham coming to know the Lord. And there is the Westminster Hotel, and there was a famous meeting, and it's called the Prayer Meeting in 1949. Billy Graham was getting ready to go out to 1949 to some meetings out in Los Angeles, California, and he asked people to pray for him in Winona Lake, Indiana. And that's a group of the Youth for Christ people. And that very next weekend is when Billy Graham's popularity exploded all over the United States. And became very popular in 1949. And in the beginning, when Billy Graham first started, Mrs. Sunday would come and speak in some of his meetings. And usually Homer Rodeheaver and Mrs. Sunday would give him one night to come and speak. So Homer Rodeheaver might come and speak, or Mrs. Sunday might come and speak. And there's the Los Angeles Crusade in 1949. Again, that was kind of where Billy Graham became popular. So, and Winona Lake, Indiana was a very popular place, and they even did the Hour of Decision. I don't know if anybody's ever listened to Billy Graham, the Hour of Decision. But they had the Billy Sunday Tabernacle right there in Winona Lake, Indiana, and they would do the Hour of Decision right in the Billy Sunday Tabernacle. So there's a lot of connections between the two. They said, now what's the connection between Ronald Reagan and Billy Sunday? How would that work? Well, I was told this by somebody out in North Carolina, and they said that one of the things Billy Sunday did was he gave a lot of money when he had his campaigns. When he got paid, he would give money to different things. And one of the money he gave was for like YMCAs. And because that's one of the first jobs he ever had as a Christian was at a YMCA. So Billy Sunday had a revival meeting in Dixon, Illinois in 1908. And so Billy Sunday gave money to build a YMCA in 1908. Well, Ronald Reagan was living in Dixon, Illinois. And so it just so happened that the YMCA that Billy Sunday gave money for is where Ronald Reagan learned to swim. And he saved 77 people in the Rock River in Dixon, Illinois. So you just never know when you give money to something how it could affect. A couple things I wanted to do. I've got a present for Kathy and the Ames Historical Society. I always try to give, if somebody wants me to come in and speak, I always try to give my present of some kind just to show I appreciate the opportunity to come. So I've got one for Alex, actually, and I got one for Kathy for the Historical Society. So Alex, you're going to have to come up here, buddy. Now, I'm going to let you open this up. I talked to Alex a little bit about this earlier, but go ahead and actually in 1999, I'll give you a little background on this. When I first started got interested in this, I called up somebody, and I talked to Farwell Brown, and I said, Farwell, would you be willing to go out to the Corey Family Cemetery and And we'll get a video camera out there, and you can talk about what you know about the Corey Family Cemetery. And so Farwell went out there in 1999, and he gave a whole little 20-minute presentation about what he knew about the Corey Family Cemetery. And so it's just a little talk. I thought maybe you could use it for your historical society. And then there's the transcript there.
Thank you. My favorite kind of VHS tape, already converted.
So Kathy, I get this for you and your historical society. Could somebody get a picture ready of this? Do you have a camera?
This has never happened to us before.
Well, the first time for everything.
Oh my gosh! Oh, this is beautiful. Billy Sunday, Ames, Iowa, preaching in the New York City Tabernacle. Wow.
Can you get a picture together? We good?
Are we good?
All right.
Okay. Jeez, Craig, thank you so much.
You know, this is my pleasure. It's my pleasure to be here.
So beautiful. Craig, would you be willing to answer some questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, if anybody has any questions, feel free to stand up. Yep. Mm-hmm.
The family name was Coy. When did Billy Sunday take the Sunday name, and did he do it legally since his family was Sunday too? When the name change?
William Sunday was his dad, and I guess the name changed when Mary Jane Corey, married William Sunday, and so then his name became Sunday through that. So that's how his name got changed.
His dad's name was Sunday.
Yep, and I'll tell you a real quick story about that. I was reading the Chattanooga Times. Billy always wondered, why am I called William Ashley Sunday? Well, William Sunday was the Civil War. He went down to Alabama, and he met a guy named Ashley down there, and he took care of Billy's dad. He took care of Billy's dad, and so he wrote back home, and they think that that's how he got his name Ashley Sunday, because William Sunday wrote back home and said, give my son the middle name of Ashley. So that's how he got the middle name Ashley, because somebody who took care of his dad when his dad was almost dying. So anyway, next question, anybody? Feel free.
Where's the cemetery that he's buried in? Oh, Billy Sunday.
He's buried in Chicago. There's a Forest Hill Cemetery in Chicago. He's buried there with his wife, his 3 sons, right there together. And his daughter is buried in Sturgis, Michigan. So.
And the Corey family cemetery, Billy Sunday's grandparents, is south of Highway 30. If you take the road out to the youth sports complex, you'll pass that little white fenced-in thing. And actually, you can see that white fence from Highway 30 when you're going out to the Interstate 35.
Do either of you know if he had preached very much in Ames or had revivals?
He had Chautauqua meetings in Ames. He never had any of his big tabernacle meetings in Ames. But I think in that video that I gave to Alex, it talks about he came to the Iowa State Fair and did some meetings. I think Farwell talks about that a little bit.
And this is so interesting. The first poured concrete structure on Main Street is the building that was Luculon's, there at the corner of Burnett and Main. And it was unusual architecture, the very first time they had used poured concrete. And when they dedicated that building, Billy Sunday came. I don't know how that happened, but the Olson family were horticulturalists. They were selling seeds and flowers, and they built this building to be their retail outlet. And for some reason, I don't know how this happened, they got Billy Sunday to come to the dedication.
Very neat. Who else? I think you had a question?
Are there grandchildren?
No grandchildren. Nope. Mm-mm.
Duh, yes, of course. Yes, that road that goes out to the youth sports complex is Billy Sunday Drive for that reason. Yeah.
Did he ever go west of Iowa? Most of the things that we're talking about here were in Indiana, Illinois.
Yeah, he started his career in Iowa, and then he went to Illinois, and then he did go out west to Los Angeles a few times. But he then, after 1920, he went down south a lot. He found there was a real receptive audiences down south. So most of his meetings were kind of in the Midwest and then down the South and kind of some in the East.
This isn't actually a question, but I thought something you might be interested to hear. A few years ago, I went to a church financial workshop conference, and the gentleman leading it was from Indiana. In the middle of the discussion, at one point, he claimed Billy Sunday as a native of Indiana. He was corrected. And he said he was a little shocked to discover he was giving this presentation right near where Billy Sunday had been born.
That was a mistake.
Where did you say he had some orchards? Where was that?
He had some orchards. He had a fruit orchard out in Oregon.
So how did he get to Oregon then?
Oh well, he had these orchards there in the summertime. A lot of times when he didn't have meetings, and it was a way for him to get away from society and just kind of work out on the farm and build these fruit orchards. He would take his family there because he just kind of wanted to be. And again, he liked farm life. He liked growing things, and he just kind of remember that time when he was growing up on the farm in Ames.
Craig, I had a question. Toward the end of his life, he was able to live in Indiana, in Winona Lake. Did his particular style of preaching go out of style? Was there sort of a drop in interest in what he was doing?
I think, in the 1920s and 1930s, I think he probably, the tabernacles eventually kind of dwindled away. They stopped the tabernacle meetings probably, maybe early 1920s. And probably by the end of his life, he was doing churches and opera houses or churches, just like he had kind of done when he was started. I mean, he's always very popular. But in the 20s, people were distracted or interested in other things, and that was the time of the Roaring 20s. So that was, so there was a change there.
There was a change.
But Billy Graham was a dramatic speaker too.
Yeah.
Yes, he would have been in eastern Nebraska, like Omaha.
Yep. He had a big meeting. He had one of his really big meetings was in Omaha, Nebraska. And I can't remember the year, but right with me, but it was in 1910 or 1911, somewhere around there. I can't really remember.
One more question. Back here.
Actual family property, where is that located?
Oh, you mean now?
Yeah.
The Sunday home, the Billy Sunday home in Winona Lake, Indiana, was taken over by the Winona Lake Historical Society. And so it basically is owned by the Historical Society in Winona Lake. Oh, Kathy can answer that maybe. Probably better than me.
That property actually eventually became property of the city of Ames, and it was really very close to the location of the old water treatment plant. So, I'm not precisely sure, but that's what the provenance was up until not too long ago. So it belonged to the city of Ames.
So that cemetery, is that on it or near it?
It's on the Corey family farm. So it's on the farm where he grew up. Yep.
Any other questions?
I think that's
okay.
And if you have questions, Craig is going to be up at the table, and if you would like to have him sign a book and buy one tonight, or the